I came home one Tuesday afternoon, and for a second I honestly thought I had pulled into the wrong driveway, because there was a fence where my land used to be. Not a small one either. A clean, bright white vinyl fence, 4 feet tall, running straight across the front of my side lot like it had always belonged there. And right in the middle of it, zip-tied like some kind of official declaration, was a laminated sign that said, Community Buffer Zone, Property of Ridgeview Estates HOA. I just sat there in my truck with the engine still running, staring at it, waiting for my brain to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Because there is a very specific kind of confusion that hits you when reality just quietly rewrites itself without asking your permission. That strip of land had been mine for over a decade, 11 years, to be exact, and not in some vague, handshake kind of way either. I mean legally mine, documented, taxed, boring paperwork kind of mine. The kind of ownership that exists in county records and doesn't usually get challenged by a plastic sign and a committee with too much free time. It sat between my house and a patch of HOA-maintained green space. Nothing fancy, just a clean little buffer of grass and trees. But my side lot wasn't part of that. It was its own parcel. And over the years it had quietly become one of those spaces you don't think about much because it just works. I kept my boat trailer there, had a small vegetable patch running along the back fence line, tomatoes mostly, some peppers when I felt ambitious, and there was a narrow gravel path I'd laid myself that led straight to my side gate, which saved me a lot of awkward maneuvering every time I needed to move equipment or haul something around back. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and it made my life easier in 100 small ways you don't notice until they're gone. I killed the engine, stepped out, and walked up to the fence slowly, like if I moved too fast it might turn out to be real, and I remember reaching out and tapping one of the posts with my knuckles, solid, newly installed, not some prank, not temporary. This thing had intention behind it. I walked along the length of it, counting steps out of habit, and yeah, it cut clean across the front boundary of my lot, no question about it. No notice on my door, no email, no letter, no vote, no conversation, just a decision made somewhere else, by people who apparently thought proximity meant ownership. And that was the part that got under my skin more than anything. Not even the fence itself, but the assumption behind it, the quiet confidence that they could just take something because it fit better in their version of the map. I took a picture of the sign, another of the fence line, then stood there a little longer than I needed to, trying to decide if I was more confused or more angry, and honestly, it kept shifting between the two. By the time I went inside, that confusion had started to settle into something sharper. Not rage exactly, but a kind of focused irritation, like a splinter you can't ignore once you know it's there. That night, I pulled out my file cabinet, the one drawer I keep organized because it holds everything that actually matters, and I found the deed, the closing documents, the tax statements, all of it neat and boring and very, very clear. Parcel number matched, boundaries outlined, my name printed in black ink in all the places that count. There was no ambiguity here, no gray area, nothing you could interpret differently unless you were actively trying to. I sat at the kitchen table flipping through those papers while my neighbor, Carla, texted me asking if I'd seen what the HOA did, which told me two things right away. One, this hadn't gone unnoticed, and two, they hadn't exactly tried to keep it quiet either. Carla lived 2 houses down, retired schoolteacher, the kind of person who notices everything but only comments when it matters, and when I walked over to her place later that evening, she met me at the door, already shaking her head. They put that up yesterday morning, she said, handing me a glass of iced tea like we were about to discuss the weather instead of a land grab. Crew showed up around 9, worked fast, didn't talk to anyone. I asked if she'd heard anything about a vote or a meeting, and she gave me that look. The one that says you already know the answer but you're asking anyway because you don't like it. Last board meeting was 2 weeks ago, she said. They mentioned something about improving continuity between common areas, but they didn't say anything about taking private lots. And there it was, the language, vague enough to slide past people, polished enough to sound harmless, but with just enough intention underneath to do exactly what they'd done. I thanked her, walked back home in the dark, and stood by that fence one more time before going inside, just looking at it, letting the reality of it settle in properly, because once you accept that something's real, you can start deciding what to do about it. And I already knew, standing there in the quiet with that ridiculous sign staring back at me, that I wasn't going to let it stay. Not because I'm particularly confrontational. I'm not. I keep to myself, pay my dues, wave at neighbors, live and let live. But there's a line, and this was it, clean and visible and running right across the front of my property. The next morning, I took the day off work, and I went to have a conversation with the people who thought they could redraw my boundaries without ever knocking on my door. The HOA office sat at the edge of the neighborhood near the pool, a low beige building that always smelled faintly like chlorine and printer ink. And I remember walking in that morning already knowing this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. Not because I was looking for a fight, but because people who make decisions like that rarely undo them easily. There was a receptionist I'd seen before, friendly enough, and when I told her I needed to speak with someone about a property boundary issue, she gave me a look that said she had a pretty good idea what I meant, then disappeared into the back and came out a minute later with a guy I'd only met once or twice at community events. His name was Daniel Mercer, the property manager, mid-40s, clean-cut, the kind of guy who always seems calm because he's used to being in rooms where other people get emotional. He shook my hand, polite, measured, and said, "Let's step into my office," like we were about to discuss landscaping options instead of the fact that his board had just annexed my land overnight. We sat down, and for a moment neither of us spoke, just that quiet shuffle of papers and chairs, and then I decided not to ease into it. I said, "You guys put a fence across my lot yesterday." He didn't look surprised, not even a flicker, just leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded like this was all part of a script he'd already rehearsed. "The board approved a reclassification of that strip," he said. "It's now designated as a community buffer zone." I let that sit in the air for a second, because sometimes silence makes people hear how ridiculous they sound. Then I asked, "Reclassification of what exactly?" He gave a small, patient smile, the kind that's supposed to calm you down but usually does the opposite. "The parcel between your home and the adjacent green space," he said. "Functionally, it serves as a transition area between two common zones, so the board determined it would be better utilized as shared space." I remember nodding slowly, not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to keep talking. People tend to reveal more when they think you're following along. "And at what point," I asked, "did anyone think to inform the person who actually owns that parcel?" That's when he shifted a little, just enough to show the script didn't cover this part perfectly. "The decision was made during the last board meeting," he said. "Minutes were posted online." I leaned forward slightly and said, "I'm not asking where you hid the paperwork, Daniel. I'm asking why no one contacted me before you put a fence on land that's in my name." That landed, not like a punch, but enough to break that smooth rhythm he had going. He glanced down at his desk, then back up, and for the first time there was a hint of something less certain in his expression. "The board felt," he said, choosing his words carefully now, "that given the location of the lot, it naturally aligned with the surrounding common areas." I couldn't help it. I let out a short breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. "Naturally aligned," I repeated. "So if my house lines up with the street, do you get to claim that too?" He didn't smile at that, just straightened slightly and said, "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" I asked, keeping my voice level, because anger would have made this easier for him. "I'm saying," he replied, "that the board has authority to manage and adjust community spaces for the benefit of all residents." And there it was, the shift from explanation to justification, from "this is what happened" to "this is why we're allowed to do it." And that's usually where these conversations either escalate or end. I reached into the folder I'd brought and slid a copy of my deed across the desk toward him, tapping the section that outlined the parcel boundaries. "Show me," I said, "where in this document it says you can take that authority and apply it to privately owned property." He looked at the paper, then back at me, and for a few seconds he didn't say anything at all, which was the most honest moment of the conversation so far. "I'll need to review this with the board," he finally said, pushing the paper slightly back toward me like it might burn him if he held onto it too long. "Yeah," I said, standing up, "you should probably do that." And then I added, just before turning to leave, "because right now, what you've got out there is a fence on my land, and that's not a policy issue, that's trespassing." I didn't slam the door or raise my voice on the way out. I just walked past the receptionist, back into the sunlight, and took a breath that felt heavier than it should have, like the air itself had thickened a little. Driving home, I kept replaying the conversation in my head, not because I doubted what I'd said, but because I was trying to figure out what they would do next, and more importantly, what I would do if they didn't do the right thing. When I got back, that fence was still there, bright and clean and completely out of place, and something about seeing it again after that conversation made it feel less like a mistake and more like a challenge, like they were waiting to see if I'd actually push back or just accept it the way most people probably would. That thought didn't sit well with me, not out of pride, but because there's a pattern to these things, and once you let one boundary slide, it tends to invite another. That evening, instead of pacing around or venting to neighbors, I got to work. I called a licensed land surveyor, a guy named Russell who'd been recommended to me years ago, but I'd never had a reason to use until now. When I explained the situation, there was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low chuckle that didn't sound amused so much as familiar. "Yeah," he said, "I've seen this before, not often, but enough." We scheduled for the next morning. He showed up right on time. Pickup truck, faded logo on the door, the kind of equipment that looks complicated even when it's sitting still, and we walked the property together while I explained what had happened. He didn't say much while I talked, just nodded occasionally, taking measurements, setting up his instruments with the kind of quiet focus that comes from doing something the same way for a long time. At one point, he glanced over at the fence and shook his head slightly, not dramatically, just enough to register disapproval. "You've got your deed handy?" he asked. I handed it to him, and he looked it over briefly before folding it back and giving it to me. "We'll mark everything out," he said, "and then you'll have something they can't argue with." And that was exactly what I needed, not opinions, not interpretations, just facts, clean and measurable. By late afternoon, there were bright survey stakes marking every corner and boundary line of my lot, running in a straight, undeniable line that cut right through the HOA's brand-new fence like it didn't even exist. Russell packed up his equipment, handed me the official survey documentation, and before he left, he said, "If they don't move that thing after this, they're choosing a fight." I stood there after he drove off, looking at those stakes, at the fence, at the space in between where the conflict actually lived, and I realized something had shifted, not just legally, but mentally. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. That night, I drafted a formal notice, kept it simple, professional, attached copies of the survey and my deed, outlined the situation clearly, and gave them 14 days to remove the fence at their expense. No threats, no matayan, just facts and a deadline. I printed it, signed it, and dropped it off at the HOA office the next morning, making sure it was logged and received, because if this went further, I wanted a clean record of every step. Then I waited, not passively, but deliberately, watching, giving them the opportunity to fix what they'd done without forcing it into something bigger. Days passed, nothing changed. The fence stayed exactly where it was, the sign still hanging there like a quiet dare, and with each day that went by, it became clearer that they weren't planning to back down on their own. And that's the thing about deadlines, they don't mean much unless you're actually willing to act when they expire. By the end of the 2 weeks, I already knew what my next move was going to be. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. By the time the 14 days were up, it didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt settled, like a decision I'd already lived with long enough to stop second-guessing. The fence was still there, just as clean and confident as the day it went up, like it belonged more with each passing hour. And that, more than anything, made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a choice. They had the survey, they had the deed, they had a clear deadline, and they had done absolutely nothing with any of it. So early that Monday morning, before the neighborhood had fully woken up, I made 2 calls, one to the county office to file a formal trespass and encroachment report, just to put a timestamp on record, and the other to a local contractor named Mike Delaney, a guy I'd worked with once before, straightforward, no nonsense, the kind of person who doesn't ask unnecessary questions as long as the job itself is clear. I told him I needed a section of fence removed, gave him the address, and when he asked, "Is it your fence?" I said, "It's on my land." And there was a brief pause on the line before he replied, "All right, we'll be there at 8. There's something oddly calming about having a plan that's already in motion. It takes the emotion out of it, turns everything into steps instead of reactions. I made coffee, sat by the window where I could see the fence line, and just waited, not anxiously, just aware. Around 7:45, I noticed a couple of neighbors slowing down on their morning walks, glancing over, probably sensing something was about to happen, because even in quiet neighborhoods, tension has a way of making itself visible if you know what to look for. At exactly 8 o'clock, two trucks pulled up. Mike stepped out with his crew, gave me a nod, and walked over to the fence, looking at it the way a mechanic looks at a car he's about to take apart. Not emotionally, just structurally. "This all coming down?" he asked. "Everything that crosses that line," I said, pointing to the survey stakes that cut clean through the vinyl panels. He followed my finger, nodded once, and turned back to his guys. "All right, let's get to it." And just like that, it started. No speeches, no confrontation, just the sound of tools, panels being lifted, posts being loosened from the ground, that hollow plastic thud as sections of fence were stacked neatly off to the side, back onto the HOA's actual common area, where they could decide what to do with it. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't aggressive. If anything, it was almost methodical, like correcting a mistake that had been left unaddressed for too long. I stood off to the side, hands in my pockets, watching it unfold, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something which had caused so much tension could be undone in under an hour and a half by a few people who didn't have any stake in it beyond doing the job they were hired for. Around 9:30, it was done. The entire stretch of fence that had cut across my property was gone, the ground still marked where the posts had been, but open again, like it had been before any of this started. The sign was gone too. No dramatic removal, just clipped and tossed onto the pile like it had never meant anything in the first place. Mike walked over, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "You're all clear." I thanked him, paid him, and watched as the trucks pulled away, leaving behind a space that felt right again, not just physically, but mentally, like something that had been out of alignment had finally snapped back into place. I didn't even make it inside before my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Daniel Mercer. I let it ring once, twice, not out of pettiness, just to give myself a second to decide how I wanted to handle whatever came next. Then I answered, "Yeah." There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that tells you the person speaking is recalibrating their tone before they say anything. "We've been informed that you had the fence removed this morning," he said, and the difference in his voice was immediate. Gone was that smooth, confident cadence from our first meeting, replaced by something more careful, more measured. "That's right," I said. Another pause. The board was under the impression that we were still in discussion regarding that matter. I couldn't help the small shake of my head, even though he couldn't see it. "There wasn't anything to discuss," I replied, keeping my voice even. "You had 14 days to remove a structure from property you don't own. You chose not to." He exhaled softly, like he was trying to keep the conversation from slipping out of his control. "The board would like to revisit the situation and potentially discuss compensation for." I cut him off, not loudly, just firmly. "Daniel, there's nothing to compensate. The fence is gone. The land is mine. This isn't a negotiation." That landed harder than anything I'd said before. Not because of the words themselves, but because there was no space left in them for reinterpretation. He was quiet for a few seconds, and when he spoke again, the authority was gone completely. "We were trying to improve the continuity of the community spaces," he said, almost like he needed to justify it one last time. "No," I replied. "You were trying to take something that didn't belong to you because it made your map look cleaner." Another silence, longer this time. Then, finally, understood. And that was it. No apology, no admission, just a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond their control. Before ending the call, I added one more thing, not as a threat, just as a boundary stated clearly enough that it couldn't be ignored. "If anything shows up on my property again without written permission," I said, "I'll be filing a formal encroachment claim." "Understood," he repeated, softer this time, and then the line went dead. The next few days were uneventful, in the best possible way. No new fences, no letters, no follow-ups, just a return to normal that felt almost surreal after how quickly things had escalated. I filled in the holes where the posts had been, smoothed out the dirt, and within a week, you could barely tell anything had happened there at all. The garden along the back edge kept growing like it always had, tomatoes coming in a little early that season, and every time I walked that gravel path to my side gate, there was this quiet sense of, not victory exactly, but resolution, like I had drawn a line and the world had finally agreed to respect it. Carla stopped by a few days later, stood at the edge of the lot with her hands on her hips, and said, "Well, that didn't last long." I smiled a little and said, "It lasted exactly as long as it should have." She laughed, shook her head, and then, after a moment, added, "You know, most people would have just let it go." "Yeah," I said, looking out over the now open space. "That's probably why they thought they could do it." And that, I think, is the part that stuck with me the most, not the fence, not the conversation, not even the outcome, but the assumption behind it all, that convenience and authority could quietly override ownership if no one pushed back. Maybe sometimes they can, but not always. So now I'm curious, if you came home one day and found something like that sitting on your property, no warning, no explanation, how long would you wait before doing something about it? And more importantly, would you even push back at all, or would you just let it slide to keep the peace? Because somewhere between those two choices, that's where lines either hold or disappear.